Welcome in. It is Big Ten today. It is presented by Gatorade. Great to have you with us on this Thursday. Dave Revson and Jake Butt fired up for a week where the biggest game in the country is in the Big Ten.
Fired up, baby. Oh, my goodness gracious. I can't wait, man. This is the new Big Ten. Remember doing the schedule release show and we're looking at this and we thought this could be the game of the year? It is the game of the year. My goodness, is this going to be a fun weekend.
Yeah, really fired up. It's pretty amazing to think about. It's just the fifth battle between top three teams in the Big Ten this century, and it's the first one that is not Ohio State and Michigan.
Wow.
So where you talk about kind of the changing Big Ten, it gives you the opportunities to have games like this one, and it should be fabulous. It is our big story. Oregon and Ohio State, the first ever top five matchup at Autzen Stadium, will absolutely be rocking as the Buckeyes visit for the first time since 1967. Oregon's won 34 of its last 35 home games. You've got stars littering both of these rosters on both sides of the ball as two of the top 12 remaining unbeatens in college football go head to head. So many ways to break down the dominance of these two programs. You go back to the beginning of last season, the Ducks have the best scoring differential in the country, while Ohio State is second, though the Buckeyes do lead the nation in that category this year. And interestingly, as you see, the Big Ten holding down the top three spots as Penn State is next. So, Jake, let's start big picture. What kind of game are you expecting here?
The most physical game of the year. And I know you mentioned some of the stars outside. I mean, both teams go and get a new quarterback in the offseason, some running backs, some wide receivers. It's a star-studded game, but this game's going to be won and lost in the trenches. It's going to be extremely physical. And I think that graphic tells a great story of something I'm interested in. Both those teams have been dominant, right? What happened last year? Both teams, as dominant as they were, didn't beat their rivals, didn't win a conference title, didn't win a national title. So for both these coaches, I mean, this is a season-defining opportunity for whoever the winner is of this game. They get to say confidently that we are who we say we are.
The thing that's really interesting to me is this is one of these games where both of the teams come in with high-powered offenses and both come in with outstanding defenses. And so there's kind of that notion of what gives here. Does it turn into a defensive battle? I mean, typically it feels like it's the defense that ultimately prevails, and you got teams that come in that are 40-point per game type teams, and they don't score 40 against one another when the other one has an elite defense. Is it your sense this will be not a low-scoring game, but a lower-scoring game than the offensive outputs from these two teams earlier this year would suggest?
Yeah, it really could be. I think the identity of Oregon this year actually has been the defense, and Ohio State's identity is everything's looked good. You know, I look at this a little bit differently where the trenches are absolutely going to decide this game. You know, for Oregon, the storyline earlier in the season, I remember breaking this down with you, is what's going on with the offensive line. Just look at these numbers and how telling they are. Through their first three games, their O-line grade, 7th worst in the Power Four. Now, since then, they get healthy, make some change. They're 8th best. Why? The urgency this week is even greater. Dave, how about this? Ohio State's defense. They have a sack or a hit on 25% of dropbacks. Wow. 1 out of every 4. That's historic. And they don't give you anything easy. That explosive run rate, that's number 1 in the FBS. That's runs that go for more than 10 yards. So they're playing structurally sound, disciplined defense. They're flying to the ball and tackling. They haven't given anything easy to anyone. And, of course, we know Oregon likes to have explosive plays with Dillon Gabriel. But the Oregon offensive line is going to be key. The weakness has been the interior of their offensive line. They're going up against Tyleik Williams and Ty Hamilton. And you think about the structure of a pocket for Dillon Gabriel. You know, he's not Drew Aller in terms of size. The structure of the pocket is decided by the interior. If those defensive linemen are winning or pushing the pocket back into Dillon Gabriel's lap, that's going to be an issue this game. So to me, it's the interior three, the guards in the center versus Tyleik Williams and Ty Hamilton that will decide this game for Oregon.
What about on the other side? What about Oregon's defense against Ohio State offensively? We've seen Oregon, as you say, play really well defensively. Can they keep it up against the Buckeyes, who do everything well?
Yeah, well, you know, what's really interesting is you listen to Dan Lanning's press conferences, and he talked about the identity of Chip Kelly. And basically, he fully expects them to emphasize the run. Run, run, run. Of course, Buckeyes have two great running backs. I actually think a small wrinkle we'll see is Will Howard running. Last week he had 10 carries. That was his most of the season. That's more than the previous 3 games combined, or it's equal. So, to stop Ohio State's offense, you have got to stop the run. But they're so multiple, and there's so many different options with the read option, speed option. It's almost like a modernized version of the triple option with some of the schemes they run. So for Oregon, the challenge is all 11 guys have to be on the same page. Each guy on an individual basis has to do his job and trust the man next to him to do their job, and then you have to tackle. They got to stop the run and then force Will Howard to make some big-time throws in 3rd and long situations.
And I think early on this year, there was a lot of concern about whether they were good enough against the run. Ashton Jeanty had the huge game for Boise State against them. Now you look at the last 10 quarters of football, they've given up 121 rushing yards. So is that a function of them having corrected some of the flaws that we saw against Boise State, or is it a function of them not coming up against a back anywhere near the quality of Jeanty and anywhere near the quality of what we're going to see with Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson?
Well, that's the fun part that we're going to learn this weekend because, what Jeanty's doing is historic, not just on this individual season. He's unbelievable. He's really in terms of breaking. He makes a lot of guys look silly. But that's one of the exciting things about this weekend. You look at a top 4 matchup, 2 teams that were picked in the preseason to win the national championship, to win the conference title. Physicality will decide this game. I look at the last national champions, Michigan versus Washington, Joe Moore Award winner, Joe Moore Award finalist, Georgia the years prior. You know what separated them is in the biggest moments, they just imposed their will on their opponents. They just dominated them. And there's no more helpless feeling than when a team is running against you and you can't stop it. That's, to me, I talked about Oregon's offensive line. I also think Ohio State's offensive line is going to decide this one.
That's where it's really interesting, too, with Ohio State, because we came into this year when you questioned portions of the Buckeyes. Like, what are the things we're worried about? It was offensive line and quarterback. And so far, both have looked, the quarterback has looked good. The offensive line has looked really good.
Yeah.
Does it hold up against a really good defense? I think that's what we're going to find out.
You talk about the transfer names, like, of course, Judkins and Downs, and, of course, Will Howard. Seth McLaughlin, their center, he's been phenomenal, and he fits perfectly into Chip Kelly's scheme because you have to be athletic and pull around. I love giving props to the offensive linemen, the big fellas up front. So it's going to be a fun matchup from that standpoint.
Coming over from Alabama, Seth McLaughlin, and has made a nice impact there for Ohio State. So that one of the 2 big games out west in the Big Ten. There's another one as well. That is the last time we saw USC and Penn State go head-to-head. That was an epic Rose Bowl game. The Trojans, that walk-off field goal to win it. First time they've met in the Coliseum in more than 30 years. Trojans have won the last 3 meetings, but it's been a while since they have beaten a team the caliber of the 4th-ranked Nittany Lions. As we've seen USC lose 2 of its last 3 here, the common theme to me, Jake, has been they've kind of worn down. Michigan and Minnesota on the line of scrimmage ultimately just kind of outlasted them. We know how good Penn State is on both lines of scrimmage. Is that where you'll be focused most in this one?
100%, 100%. And the formula for beating USC, just to your point there, Dave, it's very clear. You have to run the ball, dominate them up front, and then when your defense is on the field, get after Miller Moss and hit him. That's exactly what Penn State does, right? So this is kind of a inflection point in the season. When you think about the offseason narratives, Penn State had to improve the offense. USC had to improve the defense. Both of them to this point are certainly improved from last year. This game will reveal how much. And for Penn State, you get Singleton back. Last week, I think, is more of an outlier than the standard. You get Singleton back, you get Katron Allen back. They are going to run, run, run. For D'Anton Lynn, let's just consider what he's saying when they meet as a defense. He's looking at his team and saying, guys, we have got to stop the run. He's looking at his linebackers and his safeties, saying, guys, we have got to stop the run. The problem is Penn State has a tight end in Tyler Warren, and I consider this, that's a conflict guy, meaning the guys that have to commit to stopping the run, the linebackers and the safeties, they're in conflict because those are the guys that would have to guard Tyler Warren when he's running down the field. To me, he's the glue of this entire offense. We were wondering who's going to be the wide receiver 1 for Penn State this year. It's their tight end, Tyler Warren, right? So
that warms your heart, I know.
Oh my gosh, yes it does. On top of all these great matchups, but yeah, I mean, if USC doesn't stop the run, the game is over at that point. They've got to stop the run.
No doubt, and this has been the issue. They're 17th in the Big Ten in rushing defense. I'm also, and you kind of intimated at this, I'm interested to see how their offensive line holds up as well, because Miller Moss has really been under pressure. It has made things more difficult on him. We know how talented that wide receiver group is, but we haven't seen them break loose on many long plays recently, and part of it is it just doesn't feel like Moss is getting enough time to complete those shots or even attempt some of those shots downfield.
He's earned my respect because he continues to get hit and continues to stand back up, but you know, if you're Lincoln Riley, you're like, forget the respect. Let's protect our quarterback. Right. And right now, you look at some of their grades, second worst in pass blocking grade amongst the Power Four, third worst overall. And the big problem is it's really their tackles that have been an issue. So if you think about a 20-hour week per NCAA rules, I'd spend 15 of those hours going over protection because who's coming to town? Abdul Carter and Denai Dennis Sutton. And Abdul was an off-ball linebacker, now moved on the ball this season as an edge. It took him a little while to get going. These past 2 weeks, he has been dominant in playing the best football of his career. Versus Illinois, he was the best player on the field, right? So something has to give for USC here. At some point, we talk about stopping the run. They haven't done it successfully. They have to protect Miller Moss. They really haven't done it successfully. The other piece of this is if you're Miller Moss, get the ball out quick. The fun part of this matchup, though, is Penn State plays cover one, press man-to-man coverage. So there's not a lot of space to get the ball out quick. USC loaded at receiver, loaded at tight end. I believe Lake McCree is coming back this week as well. Those guys have to win very quickly. There's no time to dance at the line of scrimmage. They have to win quickly, and then Miller Moss is going to have to stand in there once again and make some big-time throws.
It's kind of desperation time, too, for USC. It was a costly loss last week to Minnesota. If you start to think about what it might take to make the college football playoff, I think we all believe you're going to be able to make it with 2 losses this year. There will certainly be plenty of 2-loss teams in that playoff. When you get to 3 losses, then you're going to need a lot of good fortune to smile upon you, and it's not clear that's anything you can bank on. So for USC, backs up against the wall. We'll see if they can get it done.
Tuttle surveys. Lost the football. Washington's got it. Jumbo set. Back to Coleman. Over the top. No doubt about this one. Touchdown, Washington. The fans can feel it. Redemption here in Seattle. Washington avenges the loss in the national championship. And here come the fans. 27-17, your final at Husky Stadium.
A 10-point win for Washington over Michigan last week impressed a lot of people, including social media maven Jake Butt, who broke it down on the Big Ten Network social channels, heaping praise on QB Will Rogers, head coach Jedd Fisch, and both of Fisch's coordinators. And so now the Huskies head to Kinnick to take on an Iowa team coming off a loss to Ohio State. How do you see this one?
Yeah, again, I use the word inflection point, words plural, inflection point, because Washington very well could be undefeated.
Yes.
I mean,
couple
seriously.
plays away.
Yes, and they beat themselves, right? Whether it's special teams, certainly the penalties, they're 15th in the conference in penalties per game, penalty yards per game. Last week versus Michigan, 2 penalties for 20 yards, so they cleaned it up. Of course, what's fun about this matchup is when you're playing Iowa on the road, you can't beat yourself. That's how Iowa wins. So they get a decision to make in terms of what they want the rest of the season to be. They could be an 8-9 win team, but it starts this weekend. And for Will Rogers, we talked a ton about Curtis Rourke. Obviously, Dylan Gabriel is the easy pick for best. Will Rogers has been playing as good as anybody, and he doesn't make very many mistakes. So what's hurt Iowa in the back end, they've given up some explosives in their losses. Will Rogers is a quarterback that's willing and able to take advantage of that.
That's the thing that really stands out to me about Iowa. I know everyone wants to talk about the offense and the quarterback, and we can get into that if you want to, but to me, the thing that's surprising about Iowa is how vulnerable they have been to the pass. I mean, they're 85th in the nation, Jake, in pass efficiency defense. They were 4th last year, and they are consistently, as we know, year in and year out, one of the toughest teams to move the ball on, period, in the country. You certainly don't gash them for big plays, but we have seen that quite a bit this year. How do you see that matchup? I mean, is that something Will Rogers can take advantage of? Is it something that Iowa can shore up? I mean, it doesn't feel like it can be structural, right? Because they've done the same thing year in and year out. So what is it?
Yeah, what's interesting, too, is Iowa return. That's an experienced defense, too,
of
guys that were productive and talented last year. I wonder if it's just exhausting to continue to carry the weight of the entire team on your shoulders every single year. And how I see this matchup is, you're exactly right. You don't describe Iowa's defense as exotic. They're not going to give you a ton of looks. They play their quarters. What they do it very, very well. Well, this is a perfect game for Will Rogers. He's played as much football as anybody. Anything you do defensively, he's seen it and repped it 100 times over, going back to his time at Mississippi State. So right now it feels like Washington is kind of hitting their stride offensively. The offensive line played a phenomenal game, helped score that go-ahead touchdown against Michigan's defensive line. Like, this feels like a midpoint in the season for Washington to start to look around and say, wait a second, guys, this can be a really special year. Big test on the road versus the Hawkeyes.
And they got a lot of big tests left. I mean, I think the big challenge for Washington is you look at that schedule and you just say, my goodness, I mean, 5 of their 6 remaining games are against teams that either are ranked currently or have been ranked at some point this year.
Capable, I mean,
no doubt. I'm just saying.
Great game versus Michigan.
Absolutely. I'm just saying it's tough. I mean, when you compare some schedules in the Big Ten, theirs is decidedly harder than some of the other teams have going forward. The Huskies are trying to build on a win from last week. The Gophers are as well. And P.J. Fleck revealed the secret sauce to his team's win over USC. It turns out it was Sprite. PJ saying he gave his players a concoction which included Sprite to drink as a means to build up their confidence after the narrow loss to Michigan. It's hard to know, Jake, if that's precisely why they win, but they needed to think differently. What do you think of the motivational tactics?
I think I got to get some Sprite, and I think Deshaun Foster maybe he has to serve his team up some Sprite this weekend as well, right? Minnesota's at home. They avoid, they have an upset versus USC. Now they're kind of rolling. PJ feels good about the team. Now UCLA's at home. Boy, could they use a win. Deshaun Foster, get some Sprite or some club soda, whatever, and give it to your roster. I will say this,
any lemon lime soda will do. Yeah.
Yes, exactly, and we'll confirm that this weekend. You're most vulnerable after a loss, though, right?
Yeah.
Like you are. It's an emotional victory. You're almost hung over for a few days. It's a night game. You wake up Sunday and you're feeling good. You're walking around town, but oh my gosh, this is a short week and a long trip to travel all the way out to California. So you've got to bounce back quickly. And I think what's fun about this matchup is UCLA's run defense. They've been pretty stout, 25th in the FBS in rush yards allowed per game. We saw them really shut down Penn State's rushing attack last week. This is a big game for Max Brosmer, who I think has been everything that P.J. Fleck wanted him to be. He's been steady, efficient. He's getting the ball out to a bunch of guys. I think this is the week for him to step up and win the game like Darius Taylor did last week.
And UCLA, an area where they have really struggled, has been in the pass rush. They're just not getting to the passer at all. So, Brosmer should have some time back there. A huge difference from what we saw from UCLA a week ago. It's interesting you mentioned the motivational tactics, or a year ago, I should say. It's interesting you mentioned the motivational tactics with Minnesota because PJ really spoke to that this week and said that his message to them Sunday was, hey, there's a lot of meat left on this bone. There's a lot of places where we can get better. Mm-hmm. I think exactly for the reasons you're talking about, whereas he was trying to build them up here these last couple of weeks and really complimented the job that the guys within the facility did in keeping their chins up, particularly after the loss to Michigan. Now you've got the opposite problem, right? Now all of a sudden it's, hey, we won this game and it was amazing and the fans rushed the field and it was really a monumental win, but now you got to follow it up against a team that you probably should beat.
Yeah, and he's saying, look, guys, like this is what we're capable of. This is what we can do. You look at some of their, like North Carolina, gosh, should have won that game, right? Michigan, boy, did they have some opportunities to win that game. Like they've had opportunities this year. But what PJ is saying is they're not good enough right now to fully dominate every team on their schedule. There's going to be razor-thin margins, probably again this week. So he's saying, guys, you can do it. We need this level of emotion and discipline, play to this standard every single week.
And from UCLA's point of view, the worst part of your schedule is behind you now, right? Like, I know people criticize UCLA and just kind of the fact they haven't scored, and obviously they're 1-4 here. The last 4 teams they played are a combined 20-1.
Right.
The schedule does get decidedly easier here. I'm not suggesting that a game against Minnesota is easy by any stretch, but again, you compare it to who they have played here so far this year, and I think Deshaun Foster can look at this group and say, hey, the worst is behind us. We're at home now. Let's try to move this positively and get back into the win column.
They've been playing really hard, too. Like,
yeah.
I mean, to go on the road to Penn State, like, that's a team that's been dominant. UCLA is playing hard. And when you do that, you can always win. You can always win when your team cares and is putting forth the effort.
Interesting to see what happens at quarterback this week. Ethan Garbers reportedly did practice on Monday, but had his foot heavily taped, whether or not it's him or Justin Martin, who played reasonably well, I thought, kind of thrown into the fire there against Penn State. We shall find out. What a Saturday in college football last week, a reminder of what makes the sport so much fun. We had upsets galore, including 2 of the top 4 teams in the country going down, both from the SEC, both falling to unranked teams. Vandy's win over Bama, its first ever against a top 5 team, and they beat number 1. The Big Ten saw 2 of its highly ranked teams go down as well, with Michigan and USC both getting knocked off. And we are happy to be joined now by Fox Sports lead game analyst Joel Klatt. Joel, what a wild week in college football last week. 5 of the top 11 teams in the country got knocked off. I want to ask you about the 2 Big Ten games that involved top 10 teams losing. And you had the rematch of the national championship game from last year, and I realize Michigan isn't quite what they were a season ago, and Washington is a very different team as well. But what does the Huskies win tell us about each one of those programs and where they are right now?
Well, let's start with Washington. I think it tells us that Jed Fish is just a really good football coach, and obviously they lost a lot, as you kind of alluded to in the question, from what they were last season. And they're coming back and getting better every single week. And this is what Jed does. This is why he was able to build a really competitive winner at Arizona. And I trust that he's going to do the same at Washington. That's number 1. Number 2, that's a really difficult place to play. And I think all of these teams from the traditional Big Ten, they're going to go out to kind of the new Big Ten, if you will, on the West Coast. They're going to start to see these venues for the first time, Autzen Stadium, Husky Stadium, and start to realize, like, oh, this is easily one of the tougher places to play in the entire conference, and I think that we saw that. So that would be my second point. And then thirdly, when it comes to Michigan right now is playing really poor football, in particular in the fourth quarter, and that's not something that we were used to seeing over the last 3 seasons. When I turn on the film, I see poor decisions being made. I see structures that are not sound on the defensive side, in particular when they're blitzing. Whether they're missed assignments or just what those structures are, it kind of remains to be seen. And then they're not doing the little things in the fundamentals of the game that we saw them do a year ago, like route depth. One of the interceptions late, I thought Colston Loveland drifted down the field. That's not something that we saw last year. And so this Michigan team has a lot of things to correct, because I think they found their identity with Jack Tuttle. I think that they looked like Michigan for the first time this season, and yet those same mistakes crept up, and the fourth quarter went all the Huskies' way. And you look up now, I think that they've given up, Rev, I want to say like 63 points in the fourth quarter this year. They only give up like 45 points in the fourth quarter all year last year. So something's going on right now with Michigan, and they need to get it corrected fast.
I'm with you. It's overly simplistic to just focus on the quarterback. As you said, the quarterback play, obviously there were a couple big mistakes by Jack Tuttle giving the ball away, but the quarterback play is only the tip of the iceberg. And to your point, the defense, it really is a challenge. Let's focus on USC losing at Minnesota as well. And USC, of course, had already lost to Michigan. So now 2 losses. There was so much excitement about the Trojans coming out of week 1 and that win against LSU. Now they got Penn State at home this week. What do you make of where the Trojans are, and specifically that loss to the Gophers?
Yeah, they're another one of these teams, kind of like Michigan, that they're not equipped to make up for big mistakes. Okay, so only the best teams in the country can just make mistakes and still win football games. You've got to do the things necessary to win, and turning the football over is not one of those things. USC now has 2 turnovers against Michigan, 3 against Wisconsin, and now 3 against Minnesota. That cannot continue, because let's face it, and they would even be the first ones to tell you this, they're still trying to develop with a young offensive line. So this is not a team that's going to be, I think, a team that's going to just explode offensively week in and week out and make up for turnovers like they were able to late against Wisconsin. Now you face a team in Minnesota that we saw get much better in their loss in the second half against Michigan. I think you would agree with that. Like, we saw them find their identity. Darius Taylor, that run-oriented PJ Fleck program that we've been used to seeing over the last couple of years. We saw that start to manifest in the second half against Michigan. They lose. Now they come back and they played really hard in a really solid game against USC, and they get the 3 turnovers. USC is ill-equipped to make up for those mistakes. And now you go face a Penn State team, and Rev, this is not a great matchup for USC. Penn State runs the ball really well. They rush the quarterback really well. Those are 2 areas that USC has struggled with to this point.
That's what I was going to ask you a little bit about. It does feel like a line of scrimmage mismatch to me. Penn State feels like they are significantly better on both lines of scrimmage than USC is. You saw Penn State last week. You guys had them on Big Noon against UCLA. And there's so much excitement about Oregon and Ohio State, and we'll get to that in a minute. I mean, it's a 2 versus 3 game in your league, which is pretty remarkable. But number 4 is Penn State. So it feels like a little bit of that is getting lost in all the hype surrounding those other 2. And again, justifiable hype. But you saw them in person. Like, how legit is Penn State as a national championship type team?
I think this week has a lot to do with what I think about them in terms of their prospects on the national title stage. Because if they are, Rev, a national title contender, they would go take care of business this week because of that mismatch on the offensive and defensive line. I think you would agree with me on that. They would go out there and assert their dominance in the areas where there is dominance to be asserted. And right now, I look at this Penn State team. They have taken care of business everywhere except for the big matchups over the last couple of years. This is the next step. If they can go win a big game on the road against a USC team, it tells me that they're ready for the prime time. I love their run game. I think Katron Allen is terrific. He's consistent. Nick Singleton was precautionary, held out last week. I think he's going to be just fine this week, so he's back with that explosive run game. They've got Abdul Carter on the edge, denied Dennis Sutton on the edge defensively to rush the quarterback. And I think Drew Aller looks more comfortable and more confident than he has in his entire career as their quarterback. You throw on top of that Tyler Warren is becoming one of the most versatile weapons in college football. And this is a really good college football team. Now, whether they can take that to the top stage, I think this weekend will tell us a lot about what James Franklin has in terms of what it could be moving forward. And by the way, it's not out of the realm of possibility. Let's say Penn State wins this week. Let's say Ohio State wins this weekend, both favored. Let's say they both win next week. It's not out of the realm of possibility. Depends on what happens with Texas over the next couple of weeks, that Penn State, Ohio State play as number 1, number 2 in the country in Happy Valley on November 2nd.
Yeah, that is going to be a huge game, no matter how you slice it. But to your point, it could become maybe the biggest game of the season in the Big Ten.
Yeah.
The biggest game in the season in the Big Ten to this point is Ohio State and Oregon playing on Saturday in Eugene. Early on this year, we talked a lot about Oregon and what was going on with the offensive line, and did they run the ball well enough? Could they stop the run?
Yeah.
The challenges they had against Ash and Jenny and Boise State. It feels like they've cleaned a lot of that up. I mean, I look at these 2 teams. I don't see an obvious, discernible weakness with either one. Would you agree? And what do you think this one comes down to?
It's a good question. I mean, I do not see a weakness for Ohio State. I think I see more just like maybe a subtle question. How will Will Howard play in a huge situation with this amount of pressure? That's a question I have about Ohio State, but certainly not a weakness that I see in them. I can't say the same about Oregon because there are things that I see as not only questions but clear weaknesses. Turning the football over 3 times inside the red zone from a veteran quarterback, that's a weakness. You know, Dylan Gabriel's got to clean that up. Giving up 195 yards to Ashton Jeanty at home on the ground, that's a weakness. The fact that they gave up so many sacks over the first couple of weeks, that's a weakness. So as they've shown in some spots during the season that that's not exactly who they are, that's at least in their bag. You know, it's like a golfer. It's like you have a duck hook in there. It's like it's in there somewhere. So for Oregon, there's a couple of duck hooks in there for Oregon that we haven't seen with Ohio State. So I think on paper, Ohio State's one of the best, if not the best team in the country. Oregon has shown us that they have a very high ceiling and candidly a pretty low floor. And where they play remains to be seen. This is, I think, the biggest question about this weekend is how well prepared is Oregon? How well do they play at home? Is this going to be like an Alabama-Georgia type environment where Alabama jumps out to a big lead? Or are we going to see these things creep in? For instance, Ohio State is going to run the football. You know, like Rev, they ran it for over 200 yards and 5 a carry against Iowa. Guess what never happens against Iowa? That, like ever. It happens like 3 times in the last 4 seasons. And Ohio State, you look across and you see that Ashton Jeanty ran for 195 yards. You're going to test that, and they will.
He may win the Heisman Trophy, but I get what you're saying, right? I mean, it does show a vulnerability there.
But I mean, Travion and Quinshon are nothing to scoff at.
Agreed.
You know, I mean,
100%.
like, let's
no, 100%. Yes.
And by the way, like. Yeah. I don't know about the group of 5 winning the Heisman Trophy. Let me just say this. He better run for more yards than Melvin Gordon ran for, because Melvin Gordon ran for 2,500 yards, did not win the Heisman Trophy, and that was at Wisconsin in the Big Ten. Mariota won the Heisman Trophy. He better run for more yards than Barry Sanders ran for, because Barry did it in 11 games. Ashton's going to, have 12 or 13 games. So there are bars that he's going to have to reach, or else it's just like the schedule's not going to be difficult enough for him to win that, at least in my estimation. But people have called me a big conference snob, and I'll wear it proudly.
Well, I've called you a heck of a broadcaster, and I'll tell you what, I've got the duck hook in my bag. I've got the slice. I've got all of it. But I know that you and Gus and Jenny will hit it right down the middle of the fairway on Big Noon.
You take the analogy. You talk about broadcasting 101 right there.
I did what I could.
That was beautiful.
Arizona,
was beautiful.
Arizona, BYU. Enjoy yourself in Provo, and we'll talk to you next week. Thanks, Joel.
You got it, bud. See you.
Leaders focusing on the top running backs in the Big Ten, Caleb Johnson and Kyle Monangai, both in the top 4 in the nation in rushing, but both held relatively in check last time out. In fact, of the top 5 backs in the league, only Jordan James went over 100 yards in his last outing. He hit a career-high 166 in the Ducks' win over Michigan State. Let's focus on Monangai and Rutgers. The last 2 games have not gone well for Rutgers offensively. They had that great start to the year. They were over 400 yards 3 straight games. Now the last 2, they've been under 300. What have you seen? Is it about the opponents? Is it about something with them? A little bit of both? Yeah, what's going on here?
Definitely a little bit of both. And I think Klatt McManus early in the season was playing some of the best ball of his career, but even he's dependent on Kyle Monangai. Like not even just the offense, actually. Kind of the weight of the entire Rutgers football team is on the shoulders of Kyle Monangai. Good thing is he can carry it, but he needs some help.
Yes.
Nebraska did a great job on the interior of their defensive line, forcing Monangai to have to make cuts in the backfield. He's a powerful back. So once he gets a full head of steam, he's tough to bring down. But guys like Nash Hutmaker and Ty Robinson, they were winning at the point of attack, getting into the backfield, and Monangai had to dance, which then puts Klatt McManus in 3rd and long situations. They've had some injuries and health issues at the receiver position. They've asked young guys to step up. That's just not where they're at right now. The good thing is this week is you're playing a Wisconsin team that's struggled to stop the run, and the interior of their defensive line is still finding itself. They got some guys, transferred out. Their D lineman, James Thompson Jr., who was maybe their best defensive lineman, got hurt in camp. So this does feel like an opportunity for Monangai to get back on track. Of course, Wisconsin knows, hey, we got to stop the run.
Right. Let's focus on Wisconsin. It's just so interesting because I think we had so much conversation early on this year about who are they, what's their identity, what are they doing on offense, is this air raid going to work? with Phil Longo. I think there were questions about the defense as well, as you brought up, maybe not quite as acute, but there have been issues. The defense has not been at the level that it's been at previous years. And then they go out and just demolish Purdue. 52-6. You called the game. How much of that was Wisconsin? How much of it is Purdue? Have they solved some of these issues here? Or are you expecting some of those to manifest themselves again against a football team that's playing a lot better than Purdue in Rutgers?
You know, certainly some of it was Purdue, but from Wisconsin's standpoint, they don't care. They've just been wanting to see a game like that now, and it's really interesting, you know, as you lay it out. You know, Paul Chryst is their coach. They win a ton of games. I believe they won the most games in the FBS without a playoff appearance, right?
Yes.
They had been dominant. So then they bring in Luke Fickell, and that was to try to elevate, try to chase those small percentage points. We knew there was going to be a transition, bringing in the air raid, but here we are about a year and a half into his tenure, and they don't really have an offensive identity. That's concerning. The good thing is to get back to the Purdue game, they found something. They gave themselves a chance to say, this is who we are. Anyone can do it once, though. You now have to do it twice to say definitively that that's your identity. I think they love their offensive line. I think they believe they can run the football now. Malusi steps away, condensing the carries to their top two backs, Tawee Walker and Darion Dupree. I think they're finding themselves, and it's funny how it comes all the way back around offensively, running the football.
I thought Longo had an interesting quote this week. He said, it helps them start to realize what they're capable of.
Yes, exactly.
And so I think that kind of speaks to your point. Are you going to do that every week? I think it would be foolish to think you're going to score 52 points every week and essentially be unstoppable. But this shows you, hey, we are a good offensive football team. When we get it going, we can blow someone out. And that was obviously what they did against Purdue. And now, speaking of Purdue, they get Illinois off a bye. They had the loss to Penn State last time out where they looked really good in that first series offensively, marched right down the field. And then after that, didn't score again, had a red zone fizzle out that I think ultimately is where the game turned. Now they had a week to kind of figure things out. They take on a Purdue team that, as we said, limps into this one. What are you expecting to see from Brett Bielema's team?
What I want to see is an improvement in the run game. And there was, when we talk about offseason questions, hey, Altmaier, can he improve? Yes, he has, and they've been able to protect him a little bit better this year. The defense has been opportunistic and disruptive in forcing turnovers and negative plays. But for Brett Bielema, you've got to be able to run the ball. And right now, they're 14th in yards per game in the conference, 16th in yards per attempt, and they only have 4 rushing touchdowns on the season, which is second fewest in the conference. They have about 80% of it right now. Altmaier, at times we were wondering if he's the best quarterback in the conference. Franklin, Pat Bryant, a lot of teams would love that to have that duo out on the edge. But you have to be complementary to win in this conference. They got to find a way to run the ball.
And the offensive line really looked overwhelmed against Penn State. They gave up 7 sacks in that game. Again, now they get a Purdue team. I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but they get a Purdue team that isn't playing well. How do you handle this if you're Ryan Walters? Because I think it's one thing to lose a game like they did against Nebraska, where the offense struggled, but the defense showed some signs of life. It was a shutout at halftime before Nebraska kind of piled it on in the second half. It's one thing to play a game like that. It's fully another to play a game like they did against Wisconsin or even like they did against Notre Dame. He seemed to get him back just a little bit after the Notre Dame game, and they played a little bit better the next couple weeks. But man, this is bad. And so what do you do? How do you get him back?
You know, they've been punched and beaten and battered, and it sucks to lose in football. And it sucks to lose the way that they did versus Wisconsin last week. I think the message for Coach Walters is football is going to be hard whether you're winning and losing. It's going to be hard regardless. It's 365 days. You work every single day for 12 guaranteed opportunities. You know, that's what's beautiful about this sport is every game matters because there's so few games. So I think for Coach Walters, and he's saying this about himself too. Like he said that in his post-game presser for Wisconsin. Like he's got to be better. Yeah. For these guys, the message is, guys, it's going to be hard anyways. We have to practice anyways. We have to meet anyways. We have to play on the weekend anyways. Why not leave it all on the field? Why not play as hard as we possibly can for these next 60 minutes, and let's just see what happens. Results aside, let's see what happens when we play to our absolute maximum intense energy potential.
And when these two teams got together last year, Purdue didn't just win the game, they won the game handily. So maybe you can lean on that a little bit and say, hey, this is what we did against these guys a year ago. I realize there's a ton of turnover, and that's what's weird, I think, in this day and age, and different even from when you played, which is just not that long ago. Yeah. But in some ways, it feels like an eternity because it's so different, because the nature of the game is there's a lot more turnover on these rosters.
Hudson Card is still really talented. I mean, he was honorable mention that dude is talented. Devin Mockabee plays his absolute heart out. That dude plays as hard as anyone in the conference. Max Clare has been one of the more productive tight ends. They're getting healthy with Jamal Edrin at wide. They're not as bad as what these results have shown. I do not believe that. But now they got to play as a team, all three phases, special teams, penalties. The first step is to start to get rid of some of these self-inflicted wounds. They're beating themselves before the opponent is.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, you're literally placed with multiple separate penalties.
What can you do?
On the same play. There is a lot of beating themselves to it. I'm going to be fascinated to see how they come out because I'm with you. When we were at preseason practice, they held a lot of guys out. They did a scrimmage, so it was hard to gauge in some ways. But it feels like there's more talent out there than we have kind of seen manifest itself in results.
Yes.
And to your point, guys have to look inside, and we'll see what happens in a game that is a rivalry. Back to football, Maryland coming off a much-needed bye as they were banged up in their loss to Indiana. Ty Felton, Caden Prather, and Dante Trader all hurt in that one. Maryland coach Mike Loxley said 2 of the 3 are ready to go for this week's game against Northwestern, but he did not disclose which 2. There's an air of mystery that surrounds this game. 2 teams desperate for a win, both winless in the Big Ten. What are you watching here?
First off, the desperation. And for Maryland, they've been a good football team under Loxley. They always do they're never fun to play. But they've struggled in conference play and in October. Yes. They didn't win a game in October last year. So can they put it all together? Turnovers are going to be a big piece of this game. Maryland, great turnover margin. I think it's number 1 in the conference. Northwestern obviously trying to figure out who their quarterback is. Which team can play cleaner football for 60 minutes? That's been a theme for every game this weekend.
That is an area. Northwestern's offense has struggled really all year. But one area that they have gotten a little bit better here in the transition at quarterback is Jack Lausch has been far less turnover prone than Mike Wright was, and the offense in general has been. Yeah. So perhaps you can ride that a little bit to see if Cam Porter's healthier. But yeah, to your point, I mean, if you kind of look at what's the greatest strength here, the greatest strength is Maryland forcing turnovers and also that Maryland pass game. Man, Billy Edwards been a really good story.
Underrated, man. Yeah, he's been great this year, and hopefully he gets some of those receivers back.
Right. We'll see if Felton and Prather are the 2 that are healthy for that game. We will see you tomorrow. Wani and DiNardo. Need I say more? See you then.